In the past, we had talked about health issues, healthcare. We had talked about cybersecurity, relationship, education, career, and other subjects. Because we are in the month of February, and that's the Black History Month, this is a month that is designated to celebrate Black history, Black achievements, to American history and, in fact, global progress. So today, our parent program is titled Blacks in Nashville, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. And to help us to understand this subject is our guest this morning, and that's Dr. Learuta Williams. And I will take just a moment to introduce Dr. Williams. This is just a short introduction. If I had to give him a full introduction, we would not live here today. So I'm just going to shorten this. Dr. Learuta Williams is professor of African, American, and public history at Tennessee State University. He obtained his PhD from Florida State University in African American history with specialization in post-Civil War America. He is an erudite scholar of African American history, Civil War and Reconstruction, and public history. He teaches courses on African American history, public history, Black Nashville in history, and the African American experience in the United States. Dr. Williams has done extensive research in his fields, and his plethora of publications include an edited book titled I'll Take You There, Exploring Nashville Social Justice Sites. This book was published by Vanderbilt University Press. Dr. Williams also spearheads the North Nashville Heritage Project, an effort that speaks to encourage a greater understanding of the history of North Nashville and its historic relationship to the greater Nashville community. So, Professor Williams, on behalf of Agape House, we welcome you into our midst this morning. And as moderator, I'm Dr. Adebayo Oyebade. I'm also professor of history at Tennessee State University. Actually, Dr. Lee is my colleague there. Also, I'm assistant pastor here at Agape House. So without further ado, we want to set the ball rolling. I'll ask the first question and also a couple of questions before I throw it over to the audience. Now, Nashville is a major city in the South. I was checking earlier on. Nashville has a population of over 2 million. Of course, it's the capital of Tennessee State, probably the largest city in Tennessee. I don't know, maybe after Memphis, or maybe Memphis has greater number of people. However, it's one of the fastest growing cities in the American South. It has a fascinating history, diverse influences. Okay. Now, we're going to look at the cultural aspect later on. But it has significant Black population. Also, I checked earlier on, according to recent census figure, Blacks or African Americans make up about 26.81% of the city's population. So the question is, could you help us to understand the contributions of Black people into the historical development of Nashville? And also, you can state, Black people's contemporary position, in Nashville.
Yeah. Okay. First, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you and the pastor and the members of this wonderful body for allowing me to speak to you this morning. So thank you very much for the introduction. In all honesty, you cannot talk about the history of Nashville and the contributions of its citizens to the way the city develops without talking about people of African descent. people who were descendants of Africans arrived here when James Robertson and John Donaldson arrived here on the Cumberland. It made up about 25% of the population. They arrived here in chains from Virginia and North Carolina, where they had very, very well-established slave populations already. But they come here and they clear the lands, they make the space what it needed to be in order for the economy to grow. And these were Africans, descendants of Africans that were brought here in chains. But I humbly submit to you that they did not come here empty-handed. Their culture, the way that they looked at life, their family structure, most of that originated in West Africa. So I said all that to say this to the congregation this morning, that people that look like you, that came, whose origins were from the same part of the world as you, figure prominently in how this space develops. The way we look at Nashville today, many of you might remember when Nashville was designated the IT city. I guess that was around 2015. When we think about what allowed it to get that designation, you got to remember that Nashville is the Athens of the South, but it wasn't really the Athens of the South in the truest sense of the word until Fisk University shows up, until Walden shows up, Roger Williams University showed up, and ultimately Meharry, and the most important of all of these institutions, I think TSU, is established. Nashville is known for being the music city, and country music seems to be the thing that encompasses everything in the city when we talk about music. The most prominent instrument in country music is the banjo. And we realize that the banjo was invented in Africa. So I'm saying all that to say this. When you look at Nashville and you're trying to get an idea of how the people figured into its identity, or who figured into its identity, you probably should start by looking in the mirror first, because you all have played a prominent role in how the city developed, in its history and its culture.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nashville being a music city and the influence of West Africans on the culture of this city. I want to explore more the issue of music. Nashville has a very vibrant culture in many ways. Cuisine. If you go downtown, you have restaurants. In fact, there are African restaurants as well. But I want to focus on one aspect of pop culture, and that is music. It's no accident that Nashville is referred to as the music city. Many of the great musicians today actually started their careers in Nashville. You can mention Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, Amy Grant, and some others. So my question is that I was just wondering how you could fit African Americans into that pop culture, especially, maybe jazz. Some of us don't know this. Jazz today is mainstream American music. However, jazz was actually created and nurtured by blacks in the South, especially in New Orleans. Today we think jazz is white, music, created by African Americans in the South. And I'm sure that jazz also plays a role in development of music here in Nashville. So in that context, can you talk about the role African Americans have played in the music industry, other aspects of pop culture?
A lot Now, let me restate this. All of the music that we listen to today was influenced in some form or another by the songs that my ancestors raised up out of the cotton fields and the tobacco fields here in America. Those rhythms, those slave songs, those spirituals that animates blues, jazz, as you have so eloquently displayed, and other forms that branch out from that. Rock, R&B, and even country music. A lot of those early country records had black musicians playing in the background. Their talents oftentimes were unacknowledged, oftentimes disregarded or exploited in some aspects of it. But there would be no blues if it had not been for the contributions of descendants of enslaved Africans here. Wouldn't be any jazz, which we consider the one singular American music thing that was created here. And that said, all of that was influenced by melodies, by rhythms, by culture that originated in West Africa.
When you talk about blues, I think to me is a kind of music that celebrates or remembers the history of black people in this country, the sufferings and so on. Can you talk more about blues as a genre in the music?
And it is an expression, I would argue, expression of pain, maybe suffering, and sometimes there's hope in there. Kind of ironic in a way, but I like to listen to blues on Saturday morning when I'm frying up maybe catfish and fixing some grits, right? Yeah. And it's always, it makes me feel good in a way. But it's definitely, if you want to get a peek into our culture here in America, one of the most accessible and accurate windows of it is to listen to some blues in the morning.
Yeah. Dr. Williams mentioned frying fish and so on. I can tell you that he loves jollof rice. Nigerian jollof rice. Just like we were talking about, Ghanaian and Nigerian jollof rice, and there was a debate over that, which one is better. So he loves Nigerian jollof rice. Yeah, let me ask one more question before I throw it open to the audience. And this has to do with what is called gentrification. We know that's going on in many American cities. And this has adversely affected especially the black community, but the low-income black neighborhoods. And sometimes, historic neighborhoods and landmarks. And I think the displacement of black people and encroachment on the lands owned by blacks started here in Nashville when they built the interstate. Okay, that took a lot from the black community. So, Dr. Williams, can you help us to conceptualize this phenomenon called gentrification and how it has affected and is still affecting the black community in Nashville?
You have an interesting thing that occurs here in Nashville. Once slavery ended, there was a concerted effort to channel the newly freed black people into certain neighborhoods. Some of them might be familiar to you. Edge Hill was one of these communities. East Nashville was a community. But also North Nashville. And I as I went through the record and I'm thinking about it, I wasn't really certain that they were put in these communities with the idea that they would thrive. That is, this is a place that they are putting African Americans because they have to have them living somewhere. But a curious thing occurs in that these people transform these spaces into something magnificent. It becomes a space where you have three very prominent African American institutions emerge, and a whole bunch of black churches in these communities that are producing leaders. So these spaces that were established, that it seemed as though there were going to be places where African Americans were warehoused. They turned them into something magnificent. These is parts of towns where you could go and tap your feet and nod your head and have a good time. But as time progresses, people begin to look at these spaces and say, okay, this is actually a nice space now. It's in close proximity to downtown. So how are we going to deal with this? Gentrification is the response to that. Initially, it begins under the umbrella of urban renewal. And that is essentially getting rid of the poorest of the poor. So if you visit downtown Nashville and you go around the Capitol, if you go to the farmers market, most of those spaces were spaces where poor African Americans lived. But you also had some of the most historic black churches in those spaces as well. So gentrification, urban renewal, that causes, it's a concerted effort between the city, oftentimes the state, and developers to claim access to a land where people have lived for generations. And so what typically occurs is, you'll have maybe a small restaurant there that shows up, a place where you can buy snacks or baked goods or something like that. Then maybe a bicycle shop. But as it progresses, you see, and I'll use a term that y'all might be familiar with, tall and skinnies, those tall and skinny apartments that pop up around, that few people can afford. Few of the people that are moving to the city can't afford. And what it does is raises the property value for the people that are already there. And they have to move someplace else. So ultimately what occurs is that the population that made those spaces attractive can no longer live there. So they end up moving someplace else. And there's all kind of pressures there. When I first moved here and started paying attention to gentrification, I started wondering why folks were selling their homes or getting rid of their property. But a lot of those people were elderly people, right? And when you get older, your health might start failing as medical bills accumulate. Somebody comes to you with a $2 million check for a quarter-acre lot of land, and that might be attractive, and I can't argue against that. But the pressure is intense on these people to hold their property or to sell their property. Many of them want to hold on, but sometimes the lure of the dollars become irresistible. And ultimately you end up losing the space. The people move out, and the spaces ultimately lose their identity.
Yeah, I think it is quite glaring. If you just go downtown, you see all these neighborhoods being bought and these apartments really springing up. These guys couldn't afford, to live in there. So it's something that is really affecting the black community. I know that people are itching to ask questions. So at this time, I want to throw it over to the audience. Do you have anybody that has any question? Right here. Wait for the microphone. Yeah.
I'm Ikechi Konkwo. Thank you for being here today. I've seen your resume is pretty much rooted in studying these populations very seriously. I have two questions for you. One of them is just to what you just said now. We have poor people who lived here, many of them are elderly. The value of their properties has been appreciating, which means with their plastic, rigid incomes, they now have to pay more taxes on those properties. So it's not just about the dollar, it's the fact that they can't even afford to stay in those homes. Is there any program that attempts to offset this increase in taxes in the value of those homes in those areas? That's my first question. Is there any way you're trying to help to keep them in their houses if they want to stay in their houses but they can't afford to do so? And then secondly, you've talked about the heritage of music in Nashville. I want to find out, in your studies, what has been the role of African American faith in the emancipation of what we enjoy today? And since then, from emancipation till now, what has changed?
Okay, first to deal with your first question. There are some grassroots programs that are out there that tries to educate the public in terms of ways to keep their property. For instance, oftentimes at churches in North Nashville, there'll be a program that'll be held to discuss the issue of, how someone will own property, have purchased property in the past, and then they have multiple descendants, and everybody has a stake in it, and then by the time you get here, you have maybe 50 or 100 people with stakes in the property. Our tax assessor, and goodness, I forget Karen Johnson's official title in this city. They have information that will allow you to gain an understanding that will educate you on how to prevent that from happening, so that somebody like a big corporate entity can't come in and buy off one of the members of the inheritors and gain some stake in the property. They pay off the taxes, and then boom, the property becomes theirs. I think that we need to do a better job at collaborating between these public groups who are out there. Oftentimes they're very small, and the state that has people that are really invested in us keeping our properties. We need to do a better job, I think, at collaborating to get this information out to the public, so that if you're in a space like North Nashville, or even out here, and you go to church, you'll see a sign hanging on the wall that says, or a poster hanging on the wall that says, okay, if you're facing pressure from developers, call this number, so forth. Okay, and your second question was about the influence of the church. The church, as we look at the experience of Africans and people of African descent in this country, the church has been without doubt the strongest, most long-lasting of all of the institutions that were created. Oftentimes the churches become the biggest property owners, right? The churches become crucibles where black leadership is nourished and cultivated. And you start thinking about the leaders of the civil rights movement. All of them had a title. A lot of them had Dr. So-and-so, but before they became doctors, they were Reverend so-and-so. And wow, it's a really good question. Our churches oftentimes archives or oftentimes reservoirs of African culture. There were a lot of things that we did in our little church in Tallahassee, Florida. It was very much African in origin, but I didn't know about it until I got to college and started studying it. But of all of the institutions that we have over here that we associate with African American culture, I'm going to submit to you that the churches have been the most long-standing and the most important. Okay, and I hope I addressed your questions. Thank you for it. Oh, what has changed? I think a lot of the stuff that the churches had to do during Jim Crow, because we didn't have any choice, that is to look after the widows and the children, to provide for the hungry. We weren't getting that from the city, so that's something that we had to do ourselves, right? But once segregation ends and we get access to other spaces, to other resources, you know, those things that we used to do in the church has become diversified. Some might think that's good, but I would push back against that because there's a certain familiarity that you have with the church that you don't have with Miss what's her name that works down there at Child Services. And no slander if you work in Child Services. I was just using that as an example. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Before we take another question from the audience, I'm glad you spoke at length about the role of the church in Black history. Just this past Wednesday, we had, a talk on that, given by our own Professor Ochone, who is from Professor at Vanderbilt University. He talked a lot about the role of the Black churches, in Black history. Okay, so let's have another question.
Good morning.
Professor Ochone wants to ask a question.
Good morning, sir.
Oh, okay.
Over here. Over here. Here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
So I'm relatively new in Nashville, but I know that Atlanta is known for Black businesses, thriving businesses owned by Black people. Is there something similar in Nashville, either Black professors or Black businesses where Blacks are thriving economically?
Full disclosure, I'm going to give you some names, and these are my friends and people I love, so I'll put them out there, but this is not an exclusive list. A lot of my friends are doing well on Buchanan Street here in Nashville. There's Slim and Husky's is a pizza place that opened up there. Now they have an office. I mean, they have a setup in Atlanta, maybe 4 or 5 here in this city. This group of, and I'm mindful that these are young people too, so there's a young brother in the city named Carlos Party, who has a company called Cashville. They celebrate Black businesses in addition to selling some nice materials. But on the first Friday of every month, they celebrate something called Nashville's Black Market at the Farmers Market. And this is a space where Black businesses congregate and they sell stuff to you on Friday evening. They do more than sell stuff to you. They be having big fun down there. So if you like to dance, if you like to eat, if you just like being in a place where people are out there having fun and you want to be one of them, check them out. And they're still doing it. There is a resurgence in Jefferson Street among Black businesses. And typically you know what I'm saying, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but there were a lot of eating places, eating establishments there. And as a professor at TSU, I tried to support people in the community. I think I might have supported those eating facilities a little bit too much because it started, my clothes started getting smaller. There's that, and also, if you're into museums, I know we have the National Museum of African American Music in town, and I encourage y'all to go there. But you also have, on Jefferson Street, you have the Jefferson Street Sound Museum there. And it's a small place, and if you can imagine it being sort of like the Motown spot up in Detroit, but this spot is a museum that's curated by Mr. Lorenzo Washington. And it's one of those places, you know how there's certain places you can go and you know that your mood is going to get better after you leave there. So if you're going into his place and you're feeling down, after you leave there, you're going to feel better. If you're feeling good when you walk through the door, you're going to feel like you can take on the world. Those are just a few. Atlanta, Nashville isn't Atlanta. And I say this out of love because I'm related to a lot of people in Atlanta, right? But it shouldn't be, because we have something different to offer to the world. So I think we should embrace that. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah, before we take the next question, just in addition to what Dr. William just said, we have also businesses owned by African immigrants to this country. If you go to Bell Road, you have some stores. They may be small, but before you know it, will become more established. Yeah, so we have those as well. Let's take two more quickly. I know Dr. Chono wants to ask a question.
Well, thanks for this very informative presentation. So, two quick questions. One of them actually builds off of the last response you gave. So, an African immigrant comes to Nashville, whether from Africa directly or from another city, and wants to connect to the Black experience in Nashville. What would be your top 5 recommendations of places that they need to go to, whether it's restaurants or cultural spaces or musical spaces? So top 5 historical Black Nashville spots. And then the second question is, what specific role did Nashville play, or Black Nashville play, in the civil rights movement? Specific role.
Actually, I have that question right here, the second question. I was going to ask that, because you can go ahead and address those 2 questions.
Okay. The first question was, where would I recommend that an African immigrant or, all right, wow, that's tough. If they were to come to my office and say, Dr. Williams, take me someplace, I probably would go to the Jefferson Street Sound Museum first. Then I would introduce him to my friend Jamal Sheets, who is, I think Jamal might be the curator of the Carl Van Vechten Museum at Fisk University. I would bring them to TSU, and this is going to dovetail into your next question. But also, and this is important, and I don't know if this would be the first place, but I would take them. There's a place in Nashville called Fort Negley. It was a Civil War fort that was built by conscripted African-American labor during the war. And the thing is, during the war, people who were escaping places where slavery had disintegrated, made their way to Fort Negley. For a lot of them, the first experience at freedom was to get sick and die because they're exposed to the element. But nonetheless, they came here, and for those that survived, although they didn't have a whole lot of material possessions, they brought their culture. So their culture could be their music, their outlook on life, their dedication to education, their notions of freedom. And all of these things transform Nashville's identity. So that would be some of the places. If they wanted to go somewhere to just have fun, the Museum of African American Music is a good spot, but also I would suggest that they find some of the local spots where you have jazz musicians. I'm a big jazz fan, I'll confess, where jazz musicians are plying their trade. So we have a jazz workshop here in North Nashville. Go and check out. Okay, the second question deals with the role in the civil rights movement. I say this not as a company man, but not as a company man, but students that were enrolled at TSU played a prominent role in the movement. Most of those folks that you see in those photographs of the sit-ins, those were Tigers. A lot of those folks who saved the freedom rides from collapse and when things seemed to stall in Birmingham, most of those were TSU Tigers. Now that's not to discredit anyone from Fisk or, because all said, young people from ABC, American Baptist College, young people from Fisk, TSU, and Meharry, they played a prominent role in the movement. As a matter of fact, and I was talking about North Nashville to the sister just a minute ago, that community was a stage upon which one of the most grandest acts in American history transpired. And the African Americans were stars in that story. Okay, thank you for the question.
Yeah, unfortunately we have just less than 2 minutes. So there's one question that I have here that I thought I would not let the 2 minutes go without answering this question, but we don't have the time for that to address that question. But let me just ask one more question. Now you recently traveled to Africa. You are in Dakar, the capital of Senegal, I think late last year. Mm-hmm. So what's your impression of the continent in terms of the people, the culture, and so on?
It was, for me, it was like, you know how you heard stories about a family member, but you never met them? And that was the type of energy